The house felt different that evening, though nothing had visibly changed. I was sitting on the sofa, the fabric rough against my bare legs, my thoughts drifting between guilt and confusion. The empty spaces around me seemed heavier, the silence louder than usual. The young man, my son's best friend, had been staying with us for weeks now, and his presence was like a shadow that refused to fade. I tried to convince myself it was only temporary, a favor to a struggling student, but the lines between hospitality and something far more complicated were already blurring. My husband was away on one of his frequent business trips, leaving me alone with the quiet tick of the clock and the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. Normally, his absence brought relief, a break from routine, but tonight, it made the house feel hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors who never arrived. I traced the cracks in the wooden floor with my eyes, willing my restless mind to settle. The young man was in the kitchen, his laughter floating faintly through the walls. I remembered when he first came, an earnest, polite boy eager to prove himself. But over time, I noticed subtle shifts, the way his eyes lingered longer when they caught mine, the casual brush of his hand against my arm that felt more intentional than accidental. At first, I dismissed these moments as my imagination running wild, but denial was a fragile shield against reality. I felt the pull between my role as a wife and mother and the stirrings of a desire I hadn't acknowledged in years. It was unsettling, like waking from a long sleep to find the world unfamiliar and dangerous. I caught myself adjusting my clothes more often, smoothing the fabric over my hips, aware of the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It was a silent conversation, full of unspoken questions and temptations. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he entered the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. Our eyes met, and a jolt of electricity shot through me. I smiled, forcing lightness into my voice as I took a cup from his hands. We sat together on the sofa, the distance between us shrinking imperceptibly. The warmth of the tea was a poor substitute for the heat rising inside me. I wanted to tell myself this was harmless, a fleeting moment of companionship in the quiet house. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, fueled by loneliness and the intoxicating thrill of attention. I thought of my husband, asleep miles away, unaware of the fragile line I was about to cross. Guilt gnawed at me, but desire was louder. Hours passed, and the conversation grew more intimate, dipping into confessions and laughter that felt too easy, too natural. I noticed how his hand brushed against mine on the armrest, a touch that lingered just long enough to awaken something deep inside. My breath caught, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us. When he leaned closer, our faces inches apart, I hesitated. Memories of vows, of loyalty, of a life built on trust flooded my mind. Yet, the longing in his eyes mirrored my own unspoken needs. The room seemed to hold its breath as we closed the gap, our lips meeting softly, a single kiss that shattered the quiet. We kissed. The simplicity of those words belied the complexity of the moment, the collision of past and present, right and wrong, safety and danger. When we pulled apart, the weight of what had happened pressed down on me like a physical force. I stumbled to my feet, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom, closing the door behind me with trembling hands. Alone, I sank onto the edge of the bed, the silence now oppressive. Tears blurred my vision as I wrestled with the choices I had made, the betrayal of trust, and the uncertain path ahead. I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The morning light crept through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room, but I lay still, caught in the web of last night's turmoil. The weight of that kiss lingered, settling like a stone in my chest. My mind raced through 1,000 conflicting thoughts, none offering comfort or clarity. I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness born from loneliness and fatigue. Yet, every memory of his touch seemed to contradict that, electric, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I dressed slowly, choosing clothes that hugged my form just enough to remind me of my own presence without drawing attention. The mirror showed a woman caught between two worlds, the wife I had always been, and someone awakening to desires long suppressed. I thought about my husband, diligent and kind but distant in ways I hadn't dared to confront. Our marriage was built on routine and respect, but passion had slipped away, replaced by silence and the small disappointments of everyday life. It wasn't that I wanted to hurt him, I just craved something more. In the kitchen, the clatter of dishes and the aroma of brewing coffee filled the space as I prepared breakfast. The young man appeared, casual and relaxed, but with an intensity in his gaze that unsettled me. He moved around the room with ease, as if the house belonged to him as much as to us. I forced a polite smile, hiding the turmoil beneath a mask of normalcy. We talked about trivial things at first, classes, plans for the week, the weather, but beneath the words, an undercurrent of tension pulsed, electric and raw. When he reached for the sugar, his fingers brushed mine briefly. The contact was innocent to any observer, but to me, it sent a jolt through my body. I pulled back, guilt and desire warring inside me. As the day wore on, I found excuses to be near him, drawn inexplicably into his orbit. There was a confidence about him, a youthfulness unburdened by the years that weighed on me. I envied his freedom and resented the invisible chains of my own life. He spoke of dreams and possibilities, his eyes alight with ambition. I listened, feeling both inspired and trapped. When afternoon came, he suggested we go for a walk, a casual offer that felt like an invitation into forbidden territory. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. We wandered through the neighborhood, footsteps echoing on empty sidewalks, the conversation turning more personal. He asked about my childhood, my fears, my hopes, questions I hadn't expected and wasn't ready to answer. There was a moment when our hands brushed again, this time lingering longer. I felt the familiar heat rise to my cheeks, a silent acknowledgement of the boundaries we were testing. Yet, I also felt a surge of shame, a reminder of the life and promises waiting for me at home. The conflict tore at me, each step forward shadowed by the weight of consequences. Returning to the house, the quiet felt suffocating. I tried to push the thoughts aside, but the memory of our shared smiles and the brush of skin refused to fade. I was caught in a silent battle, my heart pulled in two directions. That evening, as we sat across from each other with cups of tea, the air thick with unspoken words, I saw the flicker of something in his eyes, an anticipation, perhaps, or a challenge. Suddenly, the moment broke when I instinctively reached out to adjust the collar of his shirt, my fingers grazing the sensitive skin of his neck. Our eyes locked, and in that instant, years of restraint melted away. We kissed. We kissed. The simple phrase echoed in my mind, stark and undeniable. It was not a story of passion or romance but a breaking point, a crossing of a line I thought I would never approach. The softness of his lips against mine was both a comfort and a shock, a reminder of what I had been missing and the danger I was inviting into my life. Pulling away, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, excitement, fear, regret. I excused myself quietly, retreating to the safety of my room where I sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. Alone, I let the tears come, not just for what I had done but for the woman I was becoming. In the quiet darkness, I faced the truth, nothing would be the same again. The house no longer felt like a home but a stage for a story I wasn't sure I wanted to live. The line between right and wrong blurred, leaving me adrift in a sea of doubt and desire. And so began the unraveling, a slow, steady pull into a world I had never imagined, where every choice carried a weight heavier than the last. The following days passed in a strange quiet, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I moved through each room as if I were trespassing, unable to shake the feeling that something irreversible had been set in motion. My thoughts clung to that kiss, not because it was extraordinary, but because it had torn through the thin layer of self-control I had so carefully preserved. I tried to distract myself with chores, errands, anything that would tether me to the routine I had always relied on. But it was no use. I could feel his presence in every corner of the house, whether he was in the room or not. I avoided him, or at least I tried to. I made sure to leave early in the morning and return late in the evening, using the excuse of errands and visits that didn't exist. I knew it was cowardly. I knew it was temporary. But I needed space to think, to breathe, to remember who I was before all of this. Before I started to feel alive in ways I hadn't in years. I spent one of those mornings at a small cafe near the park, sitting alone at a table by the window. The world outside bustled with the normalcy I suddenly felt so detached from. People laughed, walked dogs, held hands. I stirred my coffee absent-mindedly, staring into the swirling cream as if it held answers. It didn't. Nothing did. I felt like a woman split in two, one half devoted to her family, the other caught in a storm of emotions she couldn't explain or justify. And then, he walked in. I saw him before he saw me. He moved through the cafe with that familiar ease, his hands in his pockets, his gaze scanning the room. Our eyes met, and for a second everything inside me froze. I thought about getting up, leaving through the back door, pretending I hadn't seen him. But my body betrayed me. I stayed. He approached with a hesitant smile, his voice low when he greeted me. I forced a polite nod, gestured to the empty chair across from me, and he sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't heavy, it was charged, full of unspoken thoughts and questions we didn't know how to ask. Finally, he broke it with a quiet, almost apologetic tone. "That shouldn't have happened," he said. I looked down, tracing the rim of my cup with one finger. No. It shouldn't have. But the way he said it, and the way I responded, didn't carry the weight of finality. It wasn't regret we were voicing, it was acknowledgement. A mutual understanding that we had crossed a line and now stood on the other side, unsure of the terrain. He didn't press further, and I didn't offer more. When he left, he simply said, "See you at home," and walked out without looking back. That night, I returned home later than usual. The house was dark except for the faint light coming from the living room. I stepped inside, kicked off my shoes, and stood in the entryway, listening. The television murmured in the background. I thought he might have gone to sleep, but as I rounded the corner, I saw him sitting on the sofa, staring at the screen without really watching. He turned his head when he heard me and gave a small nod. I nodded back, and for a moment, I stood frozen. The same sofa. The same quiet. Only now, every detail felt sharpened. I muttered a good night and started toward the stairs. "Wait," he said quietly. I paused, one hand on the banister. I didn't turn around. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he continued. I don't know how to be around you now." His voice was careful, unsure. I understood that. I didn't know how to be around him either. But I couldn't say that aloud. I couldn't say anything at all. So I just nodded again and walked up the stairs without another word. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. I thought about the way he had looked at me, not with desire, exactly, but with curiosity, with something like recognition. As if he saw not just the woman I pretended to be but the parts one had buried over years of compromise and routine. I didn't know whether to feel seen or exposed. Over the next few days, I tried to reclaim some sense of control. I cleaned the house thoroughly, cooked elaborate meals, planned a short visit to an old friend I hadn't seen in months. But he was still there, sharing the same space, brushing past me in the hallway, joining quiet meals at the table, always present in my peripheral vision. We didn't speak about the kiss again. But something had shifted. Our interactions were polite but tinged with tension, like dancers performing steps without music, out of rhythm but unable to stop. I caught him watching me more than once, when I was loading the dishwasher, tying my hair back, reading on the porch. Each time, I pretended not to notice. Each time, my heart beat a little faster. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at the rows of dresses and blouses I had worn for years. They all felt wrong, too dull, too practical, too safe. I pulled out something I hadn't worn in a long time, something softer, with a subtle shape to it. It wasn't for him, I told myself. It was for me. To remember what it felt like to be noticed, to feel present in my own skin. He said nothing when he saw me that evening, but his eyes lingered a moment longer, and I felt a warmth rise in my chest. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I was in control. But deep down, I knew I was already slipping. The days continued in a muted rhythm, each one folding into the next with quiet predictability. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The house remained tidy, meals were served at their usual times, and the normal rituals of domestic life were observed without disruption. But beneath the surface, everything had shifted. I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. Every breath, every glance, every silence now carried weight. I became hyper-aware of my movements. How I walked through the hallway, how I set the table, how I stood at the kitchen counter. I caught myself smoothing my skirt more often, brushing invisible specks of dust from my sleeves, adjusting strands of hair that didn't need fixing. These were nervous habits, but also something else, an attempt to reclaim control, even if it was just over my own posture. The air between us had changed. He no longer filled the silence with small talk. His presence had grown quieter, more watchful. He moved through the house with an energy that felt both respectful and intrusive, like he was always waiting for something to happen. I avoided his eyes when we crossed paths, afraid of what they might reveal, or what they might confirm in me. My husband returned late one evening, his suitcase in one hand and his phone in the other, already distracted by work before he even stepped through the door. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, asked what was for dinner, and commented on how tired he was. I smiled and nodded in all the right places, performing the role that had become second nature. But somewhere inside me, something recoiled. At dinner, we sat around the table like a family again. My husband, our son, and his friend, now back in his seat, as though the last few days hadn't altered the landscape of our lives. The conversation was light. My husband talked about his meetings. My son shared a funny story from class. The young man contributed a few words here and there, but mostly listened, his gaze occasionally flicking toward me. At one point, he said something seemingly innocent, it's starting to feel like home here. Everyone chuckled. My husband raised a glass and toasted to family under one roof, and I laughed along, my fingers tightening slightly around my fork. That night, after the dishes were done and the lights were dimmed, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my own reflection. The woman who looked back at me was composed but tired. There were faint lines around my eyes I hadn't noticed before, and a certain hollowness that made me ache. I didn't feel beautiful. I didn't feel like the kind of woman who stirred desire. And yet, something had stirred. That much was undeniable. The next morning, I woke early. The house was still and cool, the air filled with the scent of rain that had fallen overnight. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea. The garden shimmered with dew, and the sky was a pale gray. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel peaceful. Alone. Untouched by the chaos I had helped create. But the calm didn't last. Later that day, I found myself in the kitchen, wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. He entered quietly, reaching into the cabinet for a glass of water. Our eyes met, just for a second, and I felt it again, that charge, that unspoken acknowledgement that we were standing on the edge of something neither of us fully understood. "I've been thinking," he said softly, his voice almost drowned out by the sound of the faucet. I didn't answer. He waited a moment, then added, "Maybe I should leave." The words hit me like a slap. Not because I disagreed, but because they sounded so final. I turned to face him, trying to compose myself. "Why?" His eyes didn't waver. "Because it's getting too hard to pretend nothing's happened." I wanted to protest, to argue that we could return to how things were, that we could undo what had been done. But the truth was, I didn't believe that. Neither did he. "You haven't done anything wrong," I said at last, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Haven't I?" And with that, he left the room, leaving me standing there, clutching a damp cloth in one hand and a rising storm in my chest. That evening, we were invited to a small gathering at a friend's house, one of those casual get-togethers where wine flowed freely and everyone pretended their lives were easier than they really were. My husband encouraged me to go, said it would be good to see people. Our son had plans with classmates, so the idea of going alone seemed unbearable. Before I could stop myself, I asked the young man if he wanted to come. He hesitated, then nodded. The party was a blur of polite conversation and forced laughter. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, sipping wine I didn't want and smiling at stories I didn't hear. He stayed close, but not too close. We didn't speak much, but the moments our eyes met were enough. They said everything we couldn't. At one point, I stood outside on the patio, away from the noise, watching the wind move through the trees. He joined me a few minutes later, standing a respectful distance away. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with things we didn't know how to say. When it was time to leave, we didn't walk side by side. He trailed slightly behind, his steps slow, as if unsure whether to follow me or turn in another direction. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house, the soft rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me, and the unrelenting noise in my own head. I had invited something into my life I couldn't control, and no matter how hard I tried to pull back, it was already too close. Too real. Too late. The next morning arrived slowly, weighed down by a fog that seemed to settle not only outside the window, but inside my chest. I moved through the motions of the day as if underwater. The air felt heavier, the rooms quieter. My husband had already left for work by the time I came downstairs. The house was still. I stood in the kitchen for a long while, watching the steam rise from my cup, tracing its delicate path upward until it vanished. He came in sometime after noon. I heard the front door, the familiar shuffle of his shoes against the wooden floor, then silence. For several long seconds, we didn't acknowledge each other. He walked into the kitchen and stood on the other side of the room, keeping distance. I didn't look at him directly. I was afraid of what might be reflected in his eyes, of what might be mirrored in mine. He asked me if I needed anything from the store. I said no. Then he mentioned he was heading out to get groceries anyway, just in case. His voice was even, almost indifferent, but I could feel the current beneath the surface. After he left, I exhaled so deeply it startled me. My shoulders ached from tension I hadn't realized I was holding. I wandered upstairs, opened the windows to let in air. The breeze was soft, warm. Outside, children played in the neighbor's yard. Their laughter floated up, pure and untouched. I leaned against the frame for a while, letting the sun hit my face. I told myself that I just needed one normal day. Just one. But normal wasn't possible anymore. Later that evening, I offered to drive him to the small grocery store a few blocks away. My son was out with classmates, and my husband had stayed late at the office. I didn't offer out of guilt or duty. I did it because I needed to reclaim some version of control, some act that felt grounded, ordinary. He accepted the offer without hesitation. The silence in the car was thick. We passed familiar streets lined with maple trees, their leaves just beginning to turn, flickers of gold and red catching the early evening light. I kept my eyes on the road, hands fixed on the wheel. When we parked, I turned off the engine, but neither of us moved. I didn't know what I was waiting for, or why my heart was beating so loudly. I could feel him looking at me, but I refused to turn my head. My fingers tightened around the keys still in the ignition. I haven't stopped thinking about it, he said quietly, barely above a whisper. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want him to say anything that would make this harder than it already was. We shouldn't, I said. He didn't argue. He didn't defend or press. But the silence that followed said everything. It filled the car, the air, my lungs. And then, slowly, deliberately, I turned to him. Our eyes met. Something pulled us forward, not recklessness, not romance. It was need. It was inevitability. We kissed. It happened without planning, without lead-up, without ceremony. It was quiet and sudden, a collapse into the moment. We kissed. And then I pulled back. I turned away, opened the door, stepped out into the cool air. The world outside hadn't changed. The streetlights buzzed softly. A man walked his dog across the road. Somewhere, a siren echoed faintly. But inside me, everything had shifted again. He followed me into the store. We didn't speak as we walked down the aisles. We didn't walk side by side. I kept my distance. I reached for oranges I didn't need, stared too long at cereal boxes, nodded absently when asked if I wanted almond or soy milk. At checkout, I fumbled for my card. My hands felt clumsy. He paid before I could manage to find my wallet. I didn't thank him. I couldn't. The words felt wrong in my mouth. On the drive back, the silence was different. Not heavy or resigned. We both understood something had been confirmed between us. Not in words, but in weight. When we arrived home, we carried the bags inside together. He placed them on the counter, then turned and walked toward the hallway. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the edge of the counter, willing myself not to cry. I had always thought that crossing a line would be loud, dramatic, maybe even filled with regret. But this was quieter. More dangerous in its silence. Later that night, when I lay beside my husband, his hand briefly brushed my arm in his sleep. A familiar gesture. One he'd done for years. It used to comfort me. Now it made me flinch. And so I lay there, wide awake, staring into the dark, my mind looping endlessly through a moment that lasted no more than 10 seconds. We kissed. And everything was different now. In the days that followed, I tried to return to the life I recognized, folding laundry, scheduling appointments, preparing meals with quiet efficiency, but nothing felt natural anymore. Each movement felt rehearsed, as though I were acting out the life of someone else. The walls of our home, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a stage I couldn't exit. He and I kept our distance. We spoke only when necessary, and even then, with an exaggerated politeness that bordered on awkward. He stayed out later, returned quietly, and disappeared into his room without lingering. I told myself this was for the best, that the boundaries we should have never crossed were now restored. But there was something false in that assumption, something naive. The weight of the second kiss hung in the air like smoke. We both pretended it hadn't happened, but the memory of it crept into the smallest cracks of the day. When I passed by the living room and saw his jacket draped over the back of the chair. When I opened the fridge and saw the almond milk he'd chosen at the store. When I caught myself humming in the kitchen, only to fall silent when I realized it was the same tune that had been playing softly in the car that night. At night, I found myself restless, unable to sleep. I would walk quietly through the house, stopping at windows and doors, checking locks I'd already locked. Sometimes I stood outside his room, staring at the door, hearing nothing, and yet feeling everything. Then I would retreat to my own bed, slip under the covers beside a husband who slept peacefully, unaware of the storm quietly unraveling a few rooms away. It was around that time that a friend invited me to a gathering. A quiet evening at her home, nothing formal, just a few familiar faces, some wine, and conversation. My husband encouraged me to go. Said I needed the break. I almost declined. I didn't want to pretend. But something in me needed to get out of the house, to breathe in a different space. I asked him if he wanted to come. The words came out before I could stop them. There was a long pause before he nodded and said yes. The evening was as expected, comfortable, predictable. People chatted about work, renovations, plans for holidays. I answered questions, smiled when appropriate, laughed in the right moments. He stood on the far end of the room, speaking to someone about school. We didn't acknowledge each other directly, but I felt his eyes on me more than once. As the evening wore on, I stepped outside onto the balcony for some air. The city stretched out before me, hazy and gold under the soft light of street lamps. The wind brushed against my face, and I closed my eyes, letting it carry away some of the noise inside my head. He joined me not long after, standing a few steps away, leaning on the railing with his hands in his pockets. We stood there in silence, not looking at each other. The sounds of laughter from inside drifted faintly through the glass doors. I wasn't going to come tonight, he said finally, his voice low. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure what he meant by saying it, not entirely. I almost stayed back, he added. Thought maybe it would be easier. Still, I said nothing. He glanced at me then, his eyes catching the soft light. But I couldn't. I didn't want to not see you. The weight of his words settled into the air between us. I kept my gaze forward, fixed on a street lamp flickering in the distance. My hands gripped the railing a little tighter. You can't say things like that, I whispered. I know. We stayed outside a few minutes longer, then returned separately to the noise and comfort of the gathering. When it was time to leave, we didn't speak much on the way back. The silence was filled with what we hadn't said, what we couldn't. At home, I went upstairs first, not waiting to see if he would follow. I needed the barrier of sleep, even if it would be shallow and filled with questions. But I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer we could keep up the illusion of control. The next day, everything felt slightly off. My husband had an early meeting and left before I came downstairs. My son called from school, asking if we could postpone dinner because of a group project. That left just the two of us again. He spent the morning in the guest room, door closed, likely working or pretending to. I stayed in the kitchen, occupying myself with baking even though no one had asked for anything sweet. The scent of cinnamon filled the house, clinging to the air and my clothes. By mid-afternoon, I needed to get out. I grabbed my keys, told him I was going for a walk, and left without waiting for a response. The park nearby was quiet, its paths mostly empty. I sat on a bench and tried to clear my mind, but it was useless. The weight of the last few weeks pressed down on me. I had always thought infidelity would come wrapped in seduction or recklessness. But it didn't. It came in silences, in glances, in moments that didn't look like anything at all until it was too late. That night, I dreamed of ordinary things, laundry baskets, grocery lists, the hum of the refrigerator, but beneath it all was the same pull, the same invisible thread winding tighter around us. When I woke up, the house was silent again. He hadn't come home yet. Or maybe he had and I hadn't heard him. Either way, I knew the balance we were clinging to couldn't last much longer. The day began like any other, the stillness of morning unfolding slowly through the open curtains. Light crept along the walls in quiet stripes, casting long shadows across the floor. The air in the house felt different, though I couldn't say why. There was a charged stillness, as if something waited just beyond the edge of sound, just beyond what could be named. My husband had left again early. Another work trip, another week of separation. He kissed my cheek with a mechanical affection that had become routine, barely registering my presence as he reached for his briefcase. I watched him walk out the door, the echo of it closing behind him ringing longer than usual. I stood there for several minutes, staring at the space he had just occupied. The silence that followed was too wide, too hollow. I spent most of the morning pretending to busy myself. The laundry was already done, the kitchen spotless, the refrigerator fully stocked. Still, I moved from room to room, wiping surfaces that didn't need wiping, adjusting picture frames that hadn't moved. I was restless and tense, waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what. He appeared mid-morning, wordless, brushing past the doorway with a nod. He looked tired but alert, like someone who had not slept but had been thinking instead. I said nothing, just turned back toward the sink where I was scrubbing a plate that was already clean. The hours stretched long and thin. The air between us was thick with history, and yet neither of us reached across it. I walked past him once in the hallway, and he stepped aside without looking at me, but I felt it, his breath, his warmth, the nearness of him. I felt it like a hum beneath my skin. That afternoon, I decided to take a drive. I didn't tell him where I was going, and he didn't ask. I needed space, distance, movement, something to keep me from drowning in the gravity of our shared silence. I drove without a destination, winding through quiet streets, past parks and empty cafes, until I found myself back at the edge of the city where the buildings grew sparse and the fields opened wide. I parked by an overlook I used to visit in my 20s, when the world felt both terrifying and full of possibility. I sat there for a long time, watching the clouds drift across the sky, feeling small but grounded, unremarkable but real. I needed that. I needed to feel like a person again, not just a sum of mistakes and hesitations. When I returned, the house was quiet. His car was in the driveway. Inside, the kitchen light was on, casting a soft amber glow across the counters. I walked in slowly, unsure of what I would find, unsure of what I wanted to find. He was sitting at the table, a cup of tea in front of him, his hands wrapped around the mug. He looked up when I entered, but didn't speak. I nodded toward the hallway, intending to retreat upstairs, but his voice stopped me. I was going to leave, he said. I froze. But then I didn't. I turned slowly, leaning against the wall to steady myself. He didn't meet my eyes. I thought maybe it would be easier if I just packed and left before anything else happened. I waited. But I didn't, he repeated. I stayed. Still, I said nothing. He finally looked at me. And now I don't know what to do. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my hands clammy. My heart beat loudly in my ears, drowning out the words I might have said. We stood like that for several long moments, two people caught in the echo of a decision neither wanted to name. Eventually, I turned and walked away. I climbed the stairs slowly, the wood creaking underfoot. I changed into something soft, something that didn't cling. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands folded in my lap, listening to the faint hum of the house. Night fell without ceremony. I heard his footsteps outside my door once, then again. I didn't call out. I didn't open the door. But eventually, after a long pause, there was a knock. I didn't answer. But I didn't stop him either. We spent the night together. There are moments that don't need to be narrated to be understood. The silence between words, the pause before a breath, the unspoken that hangs heavier than any conversation. When morning came, light pressed softly through the curtains. I lay still, watching the patterns it cast across the wall. I didn't feel guilty. Not yet. I didn't feel proud either. I felt emptied out, as if something had been poured from me slowly, deliberately. He was already gone from the room. I could hear the distant sounds of him in the kitchen, running water, the soft clink of dishes. Life, pretending to continue. But something had shifted again. Not broken. Not healed. Shifted. And I had no idea what that would mean. The morning unfolded with unsettling normalcy. The house hummed quietly, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, sunlight spreading across the table like nothing had changed. But I knew better. Something had shifted, not in the house itself, but in the fabric of how I moved through it. He didn't speak much that morning. Neither did I. We moved in careful coordination, avoiding eye contact, keeping to opposite ends of the kitchen. I poured my tea. He rinsed his plate. The silence was not angry, but cautious, as though both of us feared that even a misplaced word might puncture the surface of this fragile truce. After he left for class, I stood alone in the hallway, fingers brushing along the edge of the stair rail, trying to anchor myself. The weight of what had happened wasn't pressing on me all at once, it was seeping in slowly, moment by moment, like water finding the cracks in stone. I told myself I needed to keep moving. I cleaned the upstairs bathroom, reorganized the linen closet, stripped the guest bed and changed the sheets even though no one had slept in it. My hands stayed busy, but my mind kept looping back. When had I stopped feeling in control? Maybe it wasn't sudden. Maybe it had happened quietly, over weeks. Maybe I had chosen this unraveling, piece by piece, with every small excuse I gave myself to feel again. That afternoon, my son called to say he was bringing friends home for dinner. The relief I felt was disproportionate. Part of me was grateful for the interruption, another part terrified that the illusion of calm would fracture under too many eyes. I spent the rest of the day preparing. Chopping vegetables, roasting chicken, setting the table just right. I focused on small things because the bigger questions were too dangerous to face head-on. They arrived just after 6. Laughter filled the house for the first time in weeks. My son moved through the rooms with a casual energy, oblivious to the fault lines running beneath the surface. I smiled at his friends, served food, listened to their stories about professors and campus mishaps. I played my part with practiced ease. And then I felt it. A glance. Brief, but unmistakable. He looked at me from across the room, just for a moment, but it landed like a stone in still water. I quickly looked away, busied myself with refilling glasses. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. At one point, my son turned to him and said something about him being basically family now. It was a joke, light-hearted, followed by laughter. I smiled with the rest of them, but my throat tightened. The words hit too close to the truth I was trying to bury. Later, after they'd left and my son went upstairs, I stood at the sink, rinsing plates under warm water. He came in quietly, placed his glass on the counter. "Dinner was great," he said. I nodded, not looking up. "Thanks." Then silence again. He lingered for a moment longer, as if trying to find words that wouldn't come. I could feel him behind me, the tension between us stretching like a thread pulled too tight. Then he stepped away, and I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. I turned off the water, stood in the quiet, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That night, I went to bed early. I lay in the dark, listening to the faint creaks of the house, the distant rhythm of someone moving around downstairs. Sleep didn't come easily. I thought of the dinner table, the laughter, the careless remark about family. I thought about the quiet moments between glances, the danger hidden beneath politeness. And I thought about my husband. He was due back in 2 days. There had been a time when his return would fill me with anticipation. Not excitement, perhaps, but something resembling safety. Stability. The sense of resuming a life we had built together. But now, the thought of seeing him brought a heaviness I couldn't name. I wasn't afraid of being caught. That wasn't the shape of the fear. It was deeper than that, rooted in the knowledge that the life we had might already be over, whether he ever knew it or not. The next morning, I woke early. The house was still. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching the sky shift from gray to gold. Time passed slowly, the quiet both comforting and claustrophobic. Around mid-morning, I stepped out onto the porch. The wind was cool, the trees beginning to turn at the edges. I watched a couple walk their dog across the street, their steps easy and synchronized. It struck me how many lives were moving along unaffected, unaware of the turmoil hidden inside this house. He joined me without a word, sitting on the far side of the porch. I didn't look at him, but I didn't ask him to leave either. We sat like that for a while, two people who had once been strangers, then something else, and now something far more complicated. "I think we should talk," he said finally. The words floated in the space between us, gentle but impossible to ignore. "I don't know what to say," I replied. "I don't either. But pretending nothing's happening, it's not working." I nodded slowly, still staring straight ahead. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said, his voice softer now. "You know that, right?" "I know. But I don't regret knowing you," he added. I didn't respond. Not because I disagreed, but because I wasn't sure I could speak without everything unraveling. Eventually, he stood and walked back inside. I remained on the porch, my tea long since cold, the wind picking up around me. I pulled my sweater tighter and closed my eyes. Everything was unraveling. And yet, I still hadn't reached the end of what I'd set in motion. The day my husband returned was neither dramatic nor unexpected. He arrived just after noon, suitcase rolling behind him, phone pressed to his ear, already halfway into another conversation before he even crossed the threshold. I heard the front door open from the kitchen, his familiar rhythm of steps, the brief silence as he placed his bag down in the hallway. Then the muffled sound of him finishing his call in the living room, voice steady, unaffected. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and braced myself, smoothing down the front of my blouse as if the right fabric could anchor me to the version of myself I used to be. When he finally walked into the kitchen, he kissed my cheek and asked if there was anything for lunch. Just like that. Like no time had passed at all. "I bought bread and tomatoes yesterday," I said. "And there's cheese in the fridge." "Perfect," he replied, already reaching for the cupboard. We made sandwiches side by side, like we had done for years. It was mechanical, efficient. He told me about his meetings. About traffic on the way home. About someone at work getting a promotion he thought was undeserved. I nodded, asked questions when expected, responded with the right amount of interest. I was careful. Too careful. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and decided not to ask. Later that afternoon, our son came home with a tired expression and a half-finished assignment in his backpack. I helped him with dinner prep while my husband watched a news segment in the living room. The young man didn't appear until just before the meal. His face was neutral, his steps casual, but I noticed the pause he made in the hallway before entering the dining area. A brief hesitation that matched the one I felt in my chest. Dinner passed in practiced conversation. My husband asked about classes, about a possible internship, about a broken light bulb in the upstairs bathroom. The young man responded with calm, even charm. If there were any cracks between us, they didn't show, not then. Not in front of the others. But there was one moment, brief, almost imperceptible. I had reached for the salt, and so had he. Our hands brushed. Just lightly. Just enough. And when I looked up, I saw it in his eyes. The recognition. The guilt. The memory. I pulled my hand back quickly and focused on my plate, willing my expression to remain unreadable. After dinner, the house resumed its rhythm. My husband went to the den to catch up on emails. My son disappeared into his room with music playing low. I stood in the kitchen alone, rinsing dishes, stacking them carefully, every movement deliberate. And then I saw it, his phone. Left carelessly on the counter. I froze. It wasn't the phone itself. It was the notification on the screen. A name I recognized. A name that hadn't appeared on his screen in months. One of his former coworkers, a woman I had always suspected he'd had something with years ago, though I'd never found proof. The message preview was short. Missed seeing you this week. My breath caught. The plate in my hand almost slipped. I stared at the words until the screen faded to black. I stood still, the sound of water still running beside me. There was a strange comfort in the irony. While I had been buried in guilt and confusion, tangled in something I couldn't fully define, my husband, steady, predictable, always preoccupied, might have been living a quiet double life of his own. Or maybe it was nothing. Maybe it meant nothing at all. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Because I no longer believed in the safety of assumptions. I dried my hands and left the kitchen, my steps careful, silent. I walked upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor for a long time. My reflection in the mirror looked older than I remembered. Not just in age. In weight. In truth. An hour passed before I heard a soft knock at my bedroom door. It opened slightly, just enough for his voice to reach me. Do you have a minute? It was him. Not my husband. Him. I didn't answer, but I didn't tell him to leave either. He stepped inside quietly and closed the door behind him. He didn't move closer. He just stood near the wall, his hands in his pockets. I think your husband saw something on my face tonight, he said. I looked up at him slowly. What do you mean? I don't know. Maybe I just imagined it. Maybe I'm being paranoid. He looked uncertain. The confidence I had grown used to in him was gone, replaced by something more real. More vulnerable. I think he knows something's off, he added. Not what, maybe. But something. My mind reeled. I hadn't thought we'd been obvious. I had been so careful. We both had. I don't think he knows anything, I said finally. If he did, he wouldn't be sitting in the den watching TV. He nodded but didn't seem convinced. Maybe. I stood then, arms crossed, unsure of what to do with them. What are you trying to say? He hesitated. I think this, whatever we've done, whatever this is. I don't think we can keep pretending it never happened. We haven't pretended, I said quietly. We've just avoided. His eyes held mine for a moment. Then he nodded and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he turned and said, I'm not blaming you. I think we're both in something we don't know how to get out of. And then he was gone. I sat back down, heart thudding too loudly. I tried to steady my breath, but the walls around me felt like they were pressing in. I had thought that the worst was over. That the kiss, the night, the silence would be the extent of it. But life doesn't unravel all at once. It frays. Thread by thread. And I could feel something giving way. Not loudly. But soon. The morning after that conversation, the air in the house felt different, dense, almost metallic. As if the walls themselves had begun listening. I moved through the kitchen slowly, measuring each sound I made, the clink of the spoon in my tea, the soft pad of my slippers on the tile, the low creak of a cabinet door. Even my own breath felt louder than usual, out of place. My husband had already left for work, his usual routine uninterrupted. He had kissed my forehead as he always did, muttered something about a full calendar, and walked out the door with his coffee in hand. Nothing in his voice or posture suggested he knew. But I couldn't ignore the shift in me. The guilt was no longer distant, it had become a companion, quiet but constant, sitting at the edge of every thought. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the neighbor's dog run in circles through their yard. The sky was pale and clear, with that unmistakable crispness of autumn that sharpens every outline. The beauty of the morning made everything feel crueler. I wished, for a brief moment, that something would crash or collapse, something external to match the internal disorder I could no longer contain. He hadn't spoken to me since the night before. Not a word. And I hadn't gone looking for one either. We were both avoiding the final truth, that this was going to end. Somehow, in some form, this would have to end. There was no way forward that didn't require sacrifice. Around midday, I stepped into the guest room. It was clean, minimal, unchanged. His duffel bag sat open at the foot of the bed, half-packed. A folded shirt. A watch. A book I hadn't seen before. The blinds were slightly tilted, letting in a narrow slice of sunlight that landed right across the edge of the bed. I stood there for a long moment, not touching anything, just taking in the stillness. I heard the front door open and close. Footsteps. His voice calling out softly, unsure if I was home. I didn't answer. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, hesitated, then stepped inside. His eyes flicked to the duffel, then to me. He didn't speak right away. "I need to leave," he said finally. I nodded. There was no other response. I had known it would come to this. "It's not just because of what happened," he continued. "I think I've stayed too long already." His voice was quiet, but steady. There was no resentment in it, only fatigue. The kind that settles deep and quiet and undeniable. "I don't want to hurt your family," he said. I let that sink in. The weight of the words. My family. The thing I had always sworn to protect, to prioritize, to preserve. And yet here we were. "I know," I replied. We stood there, looking at each other like strangers who had once shared something intimate but now had only the memory of it. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. "I'll be gone by tonight," he added. "Your son's at class. He won't even notice." I nodded again. He turned to leave, paused at the doorway. "You're not the villain here." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wasn't sure he believed it. I wasn't sure I did either. The rest of the day passed in slow, painful increments. I kept myself busy with meaningless tasks, sorting mail, folding towels that didn't need folding, sweeping the same corner twice. The house was too quiet. The silence was no longer heavy, it was absolute. By evening, the bag was zipped. The car keys were in his hand. He stood in the hallway near the front door, jacket on, backpack slung over one shoulder. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. He looked up as I approached. There was something unreadable in his expression. Not sadness. Not relief. Just resignation. Neither of us reached for a hug. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't unravel us further. I hope things get better for you, he said softly. I nodded. I hope they do for you, too. He hesitated only once before opening the door and stepping outside. The last thing I saw was the curve of his shoulder as he disappeared down the walkway. The door clicked shut behind him. And just like that, it was over. But the stillness that followed wasn't peace. It was absence. I walked back into the kitchen and sat at the table, hands resting flat against the wood. I stared at the place he used to sit, the chair slightly pushed out, as if expecting him to return. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just breathed. When my husband returned later that evening, he noticed nothing. He asked about dinner, about our son's schedule, about a bill that had arrived in the mail. I responded calmly, as if nothing had changed. As if I hadn't lost something I didn't have the right to mourn. Days passed. Then weeks. The house settled into its old rhythm. My son never asked about him. My husband never mentioned the missing jacket or the absence of his shoes in the entryway. Life, it seemed, was willing to forget what it couldn't explain. But I didn't forget. I carried it quietly, like a secret bruise. Hidden beneath sleeves. Protected by silence. And some nights, when I stood by the window and the house was asleep, I'd catch myself looking toward the street, not expecting to see him, but remembering that once, I had. Once, I had opened a door I could never fully close. And now, I would live with the echo.